Okay, everybody. The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Kristen Delkamp from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our Racial Equity series titled Developing a Diverse Organization, Recruitment, Hiring, and Retention. And now it is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Sarah Breyer. And Maite, do you mind putting the slides up? You got them. Oh, you're on it. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everybody, and welcome. So happy to be here with all of you today. I'm Sarah Breyer, with an associate with Racial Equity Partners. I run my own consulting practice where I center race equity in organizational development and policy analysis. Been doing that for about 7 years, and before that did about 30 years of work in the criminal justice system. I'm here today with Maite Antelo Ovando. Maite, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good morning. As Sarah said, my name is Maite Antelo Ovando. I am a Racial Equity Partners associate, private practicing school psychologist, clinical trainer, and all sorts of things. I'm very happy to be here with you all today.
Great. So today we are talking about developing a diverse organization in recruitment, hiring, and retention. We're going to give you some tools to help you focus on how do you increase diversity in your recruitment and hiring process, how you work against biases, and how you build a workplace where all staff feel a sense of belonging and inclusion. Before we start, we always like to do a quick run through of our courageous conversations. And while this may seem like an innocuous enough topic, I know that everyone brings different experiences and backgrounds and just where you are today to the table when we come to a discussion. So I'm going to run through our standard courageous conversations guidelines. So the first is, you might experience discomfort. In fact, maybe just expect to experience discomfort. And if you do, take a breath, stay with the process, try to stay engaged to the extent that you can. Speak your truth, don't speak someone else's truth. You don't know their truths. My statements are always good. Expect and accept non-closure. We're not gonna fix everything today in 90 minutes, although we'll hopefully give you some tools to get further along the path. And finally, suspend judgment. No one wants to be judged, so don't judge others. So the quick outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about bias, moving from unconscious to conscious, how we recruit for diversity, how we measure our progress, how we conduct unbiased interviews and selection processes, and then onboarding and inclusion. So we're going to start by talking about making the unconscious conscious. So bias is key. If you're going to increase diversity in your organization, you have to address bias, and it can affect every stage of recruitment, hiring, and onboarding. So your goal is to establish protocols and systems that make your processes more standard and less prone to the natural biases that we all hold. And we do all carry bias. It's impossible not to. We have bias between groups, within groups. These are just the necessary shortcuts that we have to help us make sense of the world. We just have too much data coming at us. So you all probably heard the stat that we have 11 million bits of data every second that's coming at us, but our brain can only process 40 to 50 bits of that data. So in order to make sense of this flood of information, in order to function, we have to organize it, we have to pattern it, we have to take mental shortcuts. But the downsides to that is that the brain is making patterns based on everything we've experienced and learned in our life. And we live in a world that is unfair, in which there's prejudice, in which there's racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. So our brain is naturally going to use those cultural messages and norms to pattern. So we can't underestimate the importance of unpacking these biases and attacking them or undoing them during the recruiting and hiring process. Just two things I want to mention about, two more things about bias, and then we're going to watch a cool video. So there's two kinds of bias that come into play in the recruitment and hiring. One is similarity bias, and that's we tend to like people and and also hire people who we have an affinity for, who we identify with. The other is confirmation bias, that we have a tendency to interpret information that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs. So we only pay attention to the information that fits into the story or the narrative that we already have in our heads, and we ignore all the other data that would create a fuller picture or even discredit that one piece of information. Again, this can affect how we both how we recruit and interview, but also performance evaluations at every stage. It's impactful. I think we're going to talk about, before we can really understand and unpack biases, we're going to learn a little bit more and how to mitigate them. We're going to learn a little bit more about them. So let's go to the video right now. I think that makes sense.
One second. I'm so sorry. I'm having some technical difficulties here getting the sound. Let me try that again.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TB Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong, but it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
Thanks, Kristen. So I love that video and how it raises all kinds of issues around unconscious bias. One of the things about unconscious bias is that it's unconscious, and we don't often, it's rare that we can see bias either coming from us or even towards us. It's really invisible. So, and yet we know it's there. It's there. So the trick is to slow down and ask, is this an opportunity where bias might be coming into play, where it could be affecting my judgment? It could be impacting my decision making, right? So slow down, take a pause. Again, affinity bias, we're just gonna have an affinity. We're gonna like people with whom we identify. So recognize that and check that, and stop yourself again, pause. The flip it test is a super cool way, one cool tool to check your bias. So you can mentally just sort of flip the gender, race, ethnicity, whatever it is, with the associations that you're making and see if it feels weird. If it does feel weird, then there's probably bias lurking in your associations. So for instance, you might ask a person of color, what country are you from? And then if you were to flip it and say, well, that feel weird if I were to ask a white facing person that question. If it does, then there's probably some bias lurking in there. So you can do this in all kinds of ways, but if you're associating a particular characteristic with a particular kind of person, flip it and say, what if I associated that characteristic with a different person? If that feels weird, then there's probably some bias there. Training, cultural awareness training, bias training is great. It's got to be ongoing. It's important to do, and it's not enough on its own. It has to be part of the culture and the discussion of the organization. Everyone in the organization has to recognize that we all have biases. It's got to be just normalized to have discussions around how we can check our biases, right? And there's no shame, no blame in having a bias. We all have it. The trick is to see it, check it, mitigate it. And then this final one, gut reactions, not making decisions based on fact. Again, if you can systematize, if you can create rigorous processes, you can mitigate bias. The trick is in the processes that you create. It's going to be really hard to think your way out of this. The next slide is Dolly Chug, and she wrote an awesome book, The Person You Mean to Be. How Good People Fight Bias. She has this wonderful quote, and again about shame and blame. We need grace to let in the idea that we may not be as perfect as we thought we were. Grace means everyone is a different point in this journey. Grace means that we all make mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing. And it's more important to take a risk and talk about racism and know you might screw up than to not talk about it at all. Again, bias, we live in a biased world. We carry bias. The trick is don't feel bad about it, but open your eyes and figure out how you can mitigate it. I'm going to toss it over to Maite now.
Thank you, Sarah. I love how you just ended with this sort of call to action and opening your eyes and acting on things. And so we're going to start this process of what can you do? So what's an actionable step with recruiting for diversity? So how do you do that, right? So what we like to talk about first is shaping the job and resume review. And so to start, you want to actually look at your job descriptions, or another way of talking about this is noticing what you're putting out there in your job postings. So one place to start is, as you see on this slide, a visible commitment to DEI, right? And so sometimes there are job descriptions or job postings that say at the very top, a mission statement, again, commitment to DE&I, or that we're seeking to create equitable spaces, et cetera, right? And so when you're thinking about your job postings, it's important to have a visible commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll continue to talk about this throughout, but another thing to consider is making sure that you are actually listing the things that you need to have versus what you might want as a nice to have, right? And so one of the things that I know Sarah and I talked about preparing for this discussion today is that there are lots of instances where job descriptions actually are not specific enough. And in that are then creating situations where people aren't really getting the information that they need from the job descriptions. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that actually you want to make sure that you are encouraging applicants to apply, even if they don't meet 100% of the criteria that is listed in the job description or the job posting. The other thing to know here, which is surprising but true, there are studies that show that there is implicit and explicit bias in not only the resume review, but again, how the job descriptions are created, and that in actuality today, men tend to apply when they meet only 60% of the criteria that is listed on a job description or a job posting, and women tend to apply only, or presumably in these studies, more often when they meet 100% of that criteria, right? So you have to be aware of what it is that you are putting in as a criteria and explicitly state that even if you don't meet all of these things, you should apply, right? Again, part of this process is about widening your pool of applicants versus making restrictions that create the situations where people don't apply. So another thing you see here in terms of language, so what we mean here is the language that you're choosing when you are creating your job descriptions and your job postings. You want to make sure that you are choosing your words thoughtfully and carefully. So again, another example of sort of gendered language is sometimes what you might call masculine coded words like leader or competitive will tend to reduce the number of women who are applying for these positions. You might use words like responsible and conscientious, and those kinds of words presumably will attract more women and more men. And again, research shows that gender neutral job postings result in more applicants overall, which again, part of this process is about how are you increasing the number of people that are actually applying for these jobs that you are seeking people for. Another thing you want to make sure that you are avoiding is making statements about innate abilities, which the video sort of touched on a bit. Gender stereotypes about innate cognitive abilities emerge early, with research showing that girls stay away from games designed for really, really smart people, or really, whatever the requirements might be. This may also extend to terms like analytical mindset or analytics required. Again, the thought being that if you are using gendered language or things that someone might read and then assume, oh, I'm not qualified for this. And again, you're reducing the pool when what you want to be doing is increasing it. Another thing you might include in your job postings or ads is family leave, benefits, being again, very specific about the benefits and the salaries and those kinds of things, which we will also talk about. And then the last thing I'll touch on right here is when you are initiating your resume review, you want to, as often as possible, have it be blind. And so what we mean by that, as you see in this slide, is removing the name, removing addresses, removing specifics around the colleges that someone may have attended, because again, there is a bias. For example, let's say that, I was applying for a job and I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And what does that mean, right? Like what bias or what am I assuming about a candidate given where they went to school or where they didn't go to school, right? So again, this concept of blind resume review is meant to diminish this implicit bias that is sort of leading your process so that you are actually removing that bias as much as you can. So let me just keep going here. So the other thing that we wanted to discuss here is, again, what is the difference, or how are you placing weight on learned experience versus lived experience? So what we mean by learned experience is knowledge and skills that are gained through education, or I just talked about, again, people going to particular schools and getting their education through that. Training also that can occur even on the job, so work experience and training experience that occurs just given someone's work history. And this idea of learned experience also discusses that we value formal, again, what we might consider formal instruction, right? So educational institutions that we might give more weight to, and again, workplace education just given experience at work. Different in this case is lived experience. So what do we mean by that? So lived experience is knowledge and skills that develop out of life events. and occurrences where one has been engaged, ultimately enhancing insight and perspective. Another way of thinking about this is we value the experiences that any candidate has had over time that is not, again, that is not formal, that's more informal and just lived, truly, that's basically the definition here, right? But what is important to notice too here is that you can actually make these sort of requirements, let's say, explicit in starting with your job descriptions, your job postings. You can actually say that you are valuing lived experience. And I think that the other thing to consider there is, again, when someone is reviewing a job posting, they might think, oh, well, if I don't have, for example, if I don't have a master's degree, am I qualified to apply for this? And when you are creating that job posting, you can think about, well, do I really need someone that has a master's in, I don't know, public health, or do I really need someone that is able to make analyses happen, can make decisions that are connected to the job that I'm seeking to fulfill? So again, the move here is to make sure that you are thinking thoughtfully about what is it that you really want in the person that is applying for a job, and that they are made aware of the fact that it's not just learned experience that is valued here, it's also lived experience. I'm going to pause for 1 second. See, Sarah, do you want to add anything? Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Mate.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay. So now let's talk again about how do we do this, right? So this concept of if we need to take action and reduce our biases, become aware and then reduce them, we want to lower barriers. So what does that look like? How do you do this? So as you see here, we start off by talking about where you're doing your outreach. So you've created your job posting, your job description. And then the thought is, well, where am I going to post it, right? So where and how are you doing this outreach? With whom are you connecting? So what is the network that you are sort of diving into in order to post this information? And again, in order to increase your applicant pool. So one of the things that we talk about here is you want to build relationships with more diverse set of organizations and people and focus your time there. So for example, let's say that, I don't know, you use Indeed or you use, I don't know, all of these sort of websites that you can use to post information. But even in that process, there is an inherent assumption that everybody can access something like that, right? So that's one. Another is, are you going to community fairs, to job fairs? With whom are you, connecting in order to do something like that? And I think the other thing to consider there is, before you've even done your outreach, you want to know where you stand. So who do you have relationships with already? And when you're doing sort of a review of who are my colleagues, who are my partners, what are the organizations that I have a relationship with? If you realize, oh, this skews with this particular slant, or I don't have any relationships with organizations that are brown and black led organizations, then that already, right? There's an action step to be taken there. So you want to increase your relationships in that way. Another thing that you could do is you could host Zoom sessions or in-person outreach events, right? So again, if you want to create more access, what does that look like? It could be that it is digital and you have something like a sort of informational sort of job fair, but on a Zoom call rather than in person. Or the flip side of that again is doing something in person and noticing where are you typically going in order to create these opportunities, right? To again, access and increase the access of more people applying to the jobs that you're seeking to fill. And then the other thing you want to be really mindful of, given our discussion today, is you always, as you see on the slide, want to hire the best person for the job. You do not want to tokenize. So simply because you notice that for example, your leadership team is not as diverse as you hoped it would be, and you are in this process of reducing biases and you've increased your job applicant pool, and yet you don't then want to hire a person of color simply because you're trying to fulfill a need in that way, because that's just not, it's just disingenuous and it's not okay, right? So what we're saying here is you want to always hire the best person for the job. But if I go back a second to the concept of how are you creating this job posting, this job description, et cetera, you want to make sure that that job posting or description is actually outlining who you're looking for without creating barriers that then reduce your applicant pool, right? So again, all of these actionable steps. So we want to give you all a chance to talk to each other, because Sarah and I have talked a bit so far, and we want to put you in small breakout groups, which we're going to do in a second, but let me give you all the prompts before we go into that. So what we would like to do is for you all to share your wisdom with us and with each other. And the questions are as follows. What practices are you and your organization already using that are helping increase the diversity of your applicant pool? And what ideas or practices would you like to be happening that perhaps are not happening yet, and why, right? So again, what is already happening in your organization that is increasing the diversity of the applicant pool? And what ideas or practices would you like to start using and why? And before we go into our breakout sessions, a few reminders to make this as engaging as possible. Please have your cameras on if you're able. We understand that sometimes that's not possible, but if you are able to do this, please do so. Update your Zoom name to what name you would like to be called. Do sort of quick introductions, name, pronouns, organization in which you work. Share the space. So make sure that as you all are discussing, if it's been a couple of minutes and you've shared, then maybe pass the sort of microphone on to someone else, and keep any personal shares. So what happens in that room stays in that room, please. So I'm going to stop sharing and have Kristen help us out.
Okay.
And
I am going to open up the rooms. And how long do we have for the breakout rooms?
We have 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Okay. So
A
we
little bit
will,
over, so maybe 10, we'll go 10 minutes maybe.
okay, we've got 10 minutes. So we will see all of you in 10 minutes. And again, cameras on is a great practice. So I will go ahead and open the rooms. Thank you.
All right. So key to developing a diverse organization is you've got to be able to measure your progress. Otherwise, you won't know if you're making any. So I think the key thing about measuring progress is, and Maite talked about this, is defining initially for your organization what kind of, being clear and what kind of diversity is meaningful for your organization, right? You need to define what your goals are before you can actually start measuring anything. What are you trying to get to? What's the impact you're trying to have in your organization? What does diversity mean for you? If you can all get clarity in your organization around that, it helps you then determine what are you going to measure. So obviously we have a wide variety of characteristics that define us, that differentiate human beings from each other, that makes us similar, makes us different. We often just focus on these really visible ones: race, ethnicity, gender, age, disability, which may or may not be visible. But it also includes less obvious traits, right? Like education, religion, life experience, sexual orientation, family situation. This is where it's really important, again, for your organization to decide, well, this is what we want when we have a diverse organization. This is what we want it to look like. This is what we want it to feel like. And so that's how we're going to recruit. That's how we're going to hire. That's how we're going to onboard and retain. So to do that, you have to collect data. And people say, can we collect demographic data? We can go to the next slide. And yes, you can collect demographic data, and you should collect demographic data. You can ask for the information. The trick is that you have to make it optional. So you can ask it from your staff, your team, your clients. You can ask anybody to provide demographic data as long as you say this is an option. You can also do focus groups and survey. Thanks. Sorry, someone leaving my house. Apologies. You can also do surveys. For instance, Racial Equity Partners asks in their surveys about gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality, education, lived experience. Again, you may ask for different things in your surveys depending on the kind of diversity, how you define diversity for your organization. We often have a hunch about the barriers that prevent candidates from certain identity groups from applying, but without gathering actual data points, we won't be able to know. Actually, it's all theoretical, and we won't know. We won't be able to know, in fact, what's impeding people from applying or getting hired. This also allows leaders to take action, but it also allows others to hold leaders accountable for actually diversifying the organization. So you can collect data during your onboarding process. You can collect it during regular engagement surveys with your staff, with your clients, and you can collect it in exit interview data when your staff leave your organization. Again, all demographic data has to be optionally reported. And ultimately, just a final note on good practice, it is just good practice to know this information, to collect data and set goals. Funders and partners are going to ask it for it. Your community partners are going to ask you for it. honestly, if you're really interested in diversity and you lead with diversity, your new hires, your interviewees are going to be asking you about it. So you can use it for your organization, you can use it for your community and your clients and share it with them. It really helps to ensure that the work you're doing is authentic and engaged with community.
Sarah, I had a question come in from somebody. Can you take that real quick? It's about this slide. Are you able to collect demographic data while people are interviewing?
You know, asking a demographic, I'm going to say, I confess I'm not a human resources expert, and I don't think you can. Maite says no.
I don't think you, so let me think about this for a second. You don't want to make assumptions, right? So you might be collecting information in your head as you're meeting someone, right? But you don't want to make an assumption. So let me just use me as an example, right? So if I was applying for a job and you are curious about my background, you might perhaps make an assumption that I am a Hispanic individual. You might assume that my pronouns are she, her, hers, right there. So there are things that you can ask as introductions, but when it has to do with gender, ethnic background, racial background, these kinds of things, that it's actually, without having the law in front of me, but it's actually unlawful to ask those kinds of questions in an interview. You can't, it's like asking, another example of that is asking whether or not I'm married. Right. So there are things that, again, and to Sarah's point, there are things that human resource professionals will know right off the bat that you can and you cannot ask in an interview process. And that includes, not to get totally into this, but it also includes what happens when you're doing phone screening. Right. So for those of you that engage in phone screening after you've blindly reviewed a resume and you make a phone call, again, there are these rules that you have to follow in terms of protecting people's, really it's about protecting people's civil rights and reducing the possibility for discriminatory behavior. So I guess, again, the short answer is no.
One place that I did see, so if there's an online application, I recently saw this, that the demographic information was requested in the online application and it was optional. So, right. It asked about race and ethnicity, and it said no obligation to fill this out.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think that answers the question.
So let's go to the next slide, which is about setting goals. And again, if you don't set goals, you'll never know when you get there. You don't know where you're going. Examples of goals, you want 60% of all candidates for manager level positions will identify as a person of color. Or maybe in terms of recruitment, you're establishing 2 new relationships with the organizations that are working with Black and Latino communities. So you can focus on recruitment, and so in expanding your candidate pool is a good way to look at goals. But ultimately, I would say it's less about the numbers and more about the process. So you really want to revisit your hiring process, your recruiting, your interviewing, your onboarding. You want to look at that process regularly to see, again, where's their bias? Are there other places that we can mitigate bias to expand our pool and increase our diversity from the bottom to the top? So let's look at interviews and selection, another place where we can mitigate bias.
Let's do that. Let me just move us forward. Okay, so again, as promised, we're going to keep discussing things that are actionable. And so one of the very first things past the sort of initial recruitment process, job posting creation, perhaps phone screening, you have the interview, right? And so what we really want to emphasize here is that you want to, as Sarah just said, you want to codify your process. This is about process. And I also want to borrow something that was discussed in our small group before, which is consistency is key, right? And so what you want to be really mindful of is when you are interviewing a set, let's say you have 5 applicants for a job, you want to make sure that you have a process outlined very specifically so that you are able to replicate that process over and over again until you find the person that fits the job that you are trying to fill, right? So again, first part of this is codify your process, which really what we mean by that is create an outline as you see on the slide and really know what steps you are taking in order to elicit information from your applicant during this interview, right? So first is outline your process. Within that process, you're going to include the who, right? So who is involved in the interview process? Sometimes there are, organizations that talk about having hiring managers. So obviously the hiring manager or the person that will be supervising this new position should be involved in the process. And then there are other people that should be involved, but it really just depends on, again, on the organization and on the job that is being filled. But the point here is to make sure that when you're creating this panel or this group of people that's going to be involved in the interview process, that you have at least 2 people and that you are seeking diversity. And to echo something Sarah said, you're seeking diversity in all its different groupings, right? So maybe you want a person of color, maybe you want somebody that if they have shared this that is differently abled, whatever it is, right? But you want to make sure that you are seeking diversity and diversity of opinion so that you all are making sound decisions during your processes. And then you want to make sure that before you have entered into this interview process, perhaps even before you've entered into creating a job description and seeking applicants and increasing your diversity, you want to go through unconscious bias training, right? And so this is we're touching on this a little bit today, but this is by no means the unconscious bias training, but it is really important, again, to make the unconscious conscious, to make yourselves aware of what that bias is so that you are diminishing it as much as possible. And so another way of thinking about this interview process is creating a rubric. And so what we mean by that is, again, look at your job posting. What are the skills that you have listed? You have meticulously listed everything that it is that you want, right? In a way that is open and creating a big applicant pool. But you want to mirror that job description into your rubric because that is what you're looking for, right? And so again, it depends on how you all develop this, but the idea being that the rubric also allows for, in addition to specificity around skills, it allows for this consistent process, right? So it allows for you to be able to do the same thing with every applicant so that you are, as much as possible, reducing bias. But then, of course, at the same time, I want to point out the fact that the rubric is not going to be a magic wand. So unfortunately, it won't reduce everything because we're human. And I like to say, there are other trainings that to judge is to be human because that's just how we survive. It's a evolutionary thing without getting too much into it. But again, so we're not saying that you're going to completely reduce everything because that's impossible. But you do need to bring a strong pool of people together in this panel to help you along in the interview process. And you also, again, want to make sure that you are checking on that bias and checking each other, which is the benefit of having diverse voices in this sort of interview panel process. The other thing I want to say here before I forget is, as we just talked about, which I jumped ahead, but here is what you might list in a rubric. So you want to have your must-haves. Again, what are the things that you have to have for this position? And then write that. And then you want to talk about level of ability within these skills. You might have questions that are focused, again, mapped to the skills that you've listed in your job descriptions, and training on the process. I was actually talking to one of our Racial Equity Partners co-founders about this very recently when I was a director of clinical services in a nonprofit organization. We were asked to go through trainings before we did phone screenings, which is why I'm remembering the things that you can and cannot ask. But there was, not only was it a training and documents and references, I had a one-on-one training with an HR professional to make sure that I knew exactly what it was that I could say, exactly what it was that I could not say. And I had basically a cheat sheet in front of me to make sure that I was following along in that way, right? And so what I say, the reason that I'm giving that example is that this is not an assumption that, okay, you all have gone through this training and this is it. You want to make sure that you have created a very specific and clear process, but then you all have to come together and train on that process, right? So that then you are actually ensuring the consistency across the board, but also in some ways making yourselves feel confident in the process, right? So that if an interviewee has questions about your process, which could happen, you're able to answer, right? So again, it's very important to be trained and to practice before you're actually engaging in these processes. Sarah, anything?
Jump in.
Yep.
Yeah, there were just
Please.
2 things I wanted to mention about the rubric and the process is that bias really flourishes in unstructured interviews. So if you go into the interview and I'm like, I have some questions I'm going to ask, and we're going to chit chat, and I'm going to learn everything I need to learn because it's going to come out in the process of my discussion with this individual. That's just like a happy playground for bias. So the more structured you can get about, and especially if you're in a team, again, going to the rubric, it's not going to solve everything, and it can feel really regimented, for particularly for like human services jobs where you know that you're trying to find people who are going to be able to work with other people. Again, bias, you're going to have both affinity bias and confirmation bias in unstructured discussions. So really important to, and if you have something like likability, hey, we need someone who's just going to be able to get along with other people, then code for likability and put it on your sheet, put it on your rubric, and talk with everybody around how do you assess likability so that there can be some structure to it. So it's not just I like that person or I didn't like that person, because that's a playground for bias.
Yes. And you know what, you said that, and I want to highlight again this fantastic idea that I think Evelyn put forward about if you're doing an interview and you choose, instead of a writing sample, you choose to engage in a role play, right? And to use again sort of the housing example here, if I was hiring for a housing coordinator or for a case manager that was English and Spanish speaking, and you happen to have a person in the room, in this example, me, that speaks English and Spanish and can actually have a conversation in the room or give an example, and then they actually are able to show their skills in that way on the spot. I think that is a really great way to think outside the box of what you might consider a typical interview. So it's just such a great idea. So I wanted to highlight it again. Okay, I'm going to keep us going. And then the other thing, which I didn't say around the job description, but I was pausing to get to this slide, which is you want to be transparent about not only your process, but when you're looking at the job posting, listing the pay, right? Listing the salary. And then actually in preparing for this session with you all, we learned, because every state is different. In California, there is a law that requires an employer, as you see on the slide, upon request to provide to an employee the pay scale for the position in which the employee is currently employed, right? And actually, I can also tell you, for example, in the education world, across many states, salary scales are public knowledge. And so if someone is applying for a job, they're able to look it up and see where they fit. And the benefit of a salary scale is that it's very clearly stated that many years of experience / years of education. And I will also say for California, unless it's changed because I haven't lived there in a little while, but in California, the other benefit sometimes in educational spaces is that the education scale doesn't only include formal education, right? So it's education that you've had on the job, more professional development, but not necessarily always tied to degree. So just another way of thinking about this. But again, the point here is you want to be transparent about salary. And if, for example, let's say there's a position that you were advertising for that is only going to pay $50,000 a year, you want to be transparent about that upfront, because again, in interview processes and application processes, it's not just those of us that are seeking to fill a position seeking to see the right fit. It's also for the applicant to decide, is this a good fit for me? And one of the best ways to know is this the salary that I'm looking for? And if it's not, then I move on. And if it is, then great, right? But again, the point is you want to be transparent about salary, and in California, it's the law. Sarah, anything to add there? Okay. And let's see, is there anything? Yep. Oh, when you get the slides, they will contain the link. Yes, so just to point something out in the chat, and I apologize, I can't escape out of this because I'm showing you all my screen, but LaQuantia is telling us that when you all get the slides, you're going to have the link to the law so that you can have a reference point for that. Okay, so let's have a large group discussion, which I'm going to stop sharing in a second, but just so that you all see the prompts here. So let's share wisdom again. Here are the questions for this next discussion. So what ways are you currently measuring D&I progress at your organization, especially with recruitment and hiring? Or what questions do you have about this? And what practices are you using, or what practices have you experienced that have helped remove bias from the recruitment and hiring process? Remove, reduce, again, acknowledging the fact that you can't completely remove it because you're human, but what are practices that have happened already that have helped to reduce the bias from the recruitment and hiring process. So let me stop sharing so we can have a discussion. And if you are able to get on camera, that would be fantastic. You don't have to, but if you're able, it always helps. Let me see if I can copy the questions for you.
Oh yeah, we can put the.
Yep, I'm just about to. There we go. So the other questions, thoughts about this? What ways are you currently measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion progress at your org? And what practices are you using or have you seen, witnessed that have helped remove, reduce bias? Very curious to hear.
And if you're not measuring DEI progress, I'm curious as to, have there been efforts made to measure? What's the hiccup? What's the, or, where's the roadblock there?
Well, I'll offer kind of a thought on that, Sarah. I think that what happens oftentimes, especially in the last year and a half, 2 years, is that there honestly is so much money being RFP'd and so little time. And I don't know that people have, you take training, but you kind of just, you sit in on, you gloss over them and you're gone. And I don't know that, these are excellent trainings, don't get me wrong. But I don't know that quick trainings change a culture. I mean, they start it and they seed it, but in government, when you're looking kind of at a top-down approach almost, the people who attend trainings like this are people in the field or doing the work in the field. And I think it's hard to push up a culture change from the bottom. That would just be my opinion or what I've seen.
I think that's right. I mean, I think leadership in this work is critical. And so if leadership isn't on board or willing to listen or to be moved or to embrace DEI efforts as a priority, right? It's really tough for staff that isn't in leadership to move the organization. It's a feat. So leadership really is key. And to your point, trainings are great and they can get the conversation started, but training don't change culture, as you say. That's a lifelong, that's an ongoing process that, again, yeah.
And I'll just offer one more thought. I think, just especially when you look at the COC NOFA, that because that's a large federal thing, and they start attaching points and they ask more, detailed questions about that. I've always felt kind of like a flaw in that process was to not do a 360 within the continuum, because we can point chase all we want to and say what we want to in those applications, and those get rewarded for that process. But there's never like a 360 to see how the rest of the community really feels about things. The state's kind of the same way. We all have our applications. We write the best language that we can. We hire consultants to do that work. And it all sounds great, but in practicality, it doesn't often work that way.
And you know what, today, I feel like you just highlighted something that, we can apply to what we've been discussing today, which is you can't measure progress unless there's something measurable being looked at, right? Exactly. And so and I think, again, connected to this idea that, of course, trainings create the space to have these discussions, but then what happens after is critical, right? And so, yes, let's have the discussion. Maybe I go back to my organization and say, you know what, we brought up this idea of blind resume review, and we've never done something like that. How interesting. Can we have a conversation? How do you then get sort of your team, your HR team involved? And as Sarah said, of course, it's helpful when there's already a DE&I commitment. And I would also say that maybe there is, and sometimes it's helpful to go back to a mission statement and maybe point out the fact that, our mission statement states blah, 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 blah. If that's the case, can we do something actionable here? Can we do something that we can actually measure progress on? Because in some ways, right, like let's sort of walk the talk rather than just have it on a screen or have it in a mission, right? not to get all into this,
I
but
mean, even agency level brown bag lunches, I think, just for a discussion like this.
Yep, totally. And you know what? One other thought that I was having is you and Sarah were discussing this is again related to process. The benefit of, again, when you're engaging in anything new, there's learning to be had, right? And then afterwards, how did that go? So let's say that you implement a new process, you've done the rubric, you have a panel, you did the whole thing, you hired a fantastic person. It would be fantastic also to create a debriefing process after, so that the panel can then say, you know what, this was great, that was hard, I'm not used to using a rubric, whatever it is, right? So that then you're informing the learning as it's happening, rather than just, okay, well, and in some ways making an assumption about how well or how not well it went. Okay. Other thoughts? I feel like I'm talking a lot. You all take the mic for me. Anyone else want to share what is happening in your organizations? What ways you're currently measuring DE&I and or practices that you've seen?
We had started to do work around like getting a baseline on demographics in our organization so we could start, well, you know, like, so we're implementing strategies, right? And so we can measure the improvements made. And it's been a slow process to like even start collecting demographic information because of this. There's like HR pushback around legalities and making it that thing around like making it optional is you can make it optional, and that's it just feels like a no-brainer to me. Like, okay, you make it optional, but collect the information. But there's just been a lot of pushback, I feel like, around like, I don't know. And I think this isn't really related to either of your questions, but it's similarly related in that there's pushback around like adjusting our job descriptions and adjusting our stuff that's all around like litigation fear of litigation, and like that the stuff that we have a lot of canned language in our job descriptions that is really not approachable, it's not accessible, and it's really not it's either not relevant or it's not helpful in a job description. There could be a place for some of this canned stuff that we have, and the pushback has been, well, we need that in there so it's clear to our employees that we have these expectations, and when we don't meet them and lead to termination, that they go to sue us. And I'm like, this is the wrong conversation for when they like focus on litigation fear.
Right.
But I saw your eyes, Sarah. I'm like, oh my gosh, my boss is gonna kill me for but, and you know, I think the organization that I work for is very mindful. It has like, we have leadership buy-in to do the EDI work and DEI work, however, there is the buy-in there. But there's one, litigation fear around things, and two, capacity. So just like Teddy, you were talking about this with like all of the RFPs and all of the stuff coming down. There is so much that like we're working on implementing that, and the human resource to actually do the work is not actually present. And so we're really struggling with that too. I feel like nothing I just said is actually relevant to the prompts you gave. Sorry.
No, but really helpful to highlight how the work isn't easy. You know, we can give this 90-minute training and have all kinds of wonderful ideas. And at the end of the day, right, staff capacity to implement might be really limited, right? And that's reality. It doesn't eliminate the need, right? Because we know that more diverse organizations are going to function better. They're going to do the work better. So it doesn't eliminate the importance of it, but it speaks to that, like, good work sometimes is just hard work, right? And I don't have an answer for you. It is hard. And the litigation thing, I'll just reflect on my own personal experience. I, ran an organization and tried to create an inclusive environment, and then was told I had to put all kinds of like really yucky stuff in my employee manual. And I'm like, that's not inclusive. That says I can fire you at any time. Like, that's just mean. But required to say that in the employee manual. So there's a lot of like the litigation thing. There's a way around it for sure. I don't know it yet.
I know. I mean, I don't have an answer either, but my thought is, can you just have a link to a law? And if you're curious, here's the law. Like,
right.
Like, but I also think your example, Sage, around again, going back to the job posting description, what have you, when you start off that way, and also connected to the culture discussion, what kind of culture are you then putting forward, and what assumptions, if I am an applicant and I'm reading and the first paragraph is all legalistic and I'm not a lawyer, I'm going to be like, I don't want to work there. Like, it's not my jam. I understand it. Obviously, I would like to follow laws and procedures, etc. But if that's not really speaking to most people, it's already creating a barrier from the get-go, rather than creating this pull to join. It's creating a barrier in some ways.
This is a good segue to our next section on onboarding and inclusion. So let's spend a few minutes talking about that, and then we'll regroup as a group, because this is a fun discussion.
Yes, let me just go back for 1 second. Oops.
So I'll just start while she's so inclusion's key. So that diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity without inclusion is tokenism, and it's been shown not to work. So it's not functional. You need to have the inclusion part of the whole equation. So you may hire a diverse group of candidates, but if they don't feel included and valued, they're either going to jump to another organization, or they're just going to underperform. They're not going to perform to their full capacity because they won't feel they belong there. So if diversity is the gateway, inclusion is the pathway. And it's also important to notice that even organizations that seem really diverse by the numbers, they often tend to get wider as you go up the leadership management scale. And that is in part about inclusion, and that's about how we create pathways for our staff. So beginning is onboarding. You want good welcoming, training, orientation. You want to make sure that it includes a discussion of your DEI goals and your commitment around that. Make sure that there's meetings with other staff so they understand what the role of this person is and how they're going to interact with this person. Onboarding is a months-long process. It's not a one-day kind of a thing. So you want regular check-ins, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And you want to make sure that if you've hired someone for the job because they're qualified, but you still want to make sure that you provide the training and support for that particular role at your organization. So you may have some things that are really specific to your organization or the services that you're providing that this new hire just needs to know. You shouldn't assume that they know it. The other thing about role training and support is to make it, you want it to be really relational. So you might ask what support looks like for that person. What does support look like for you? That may be, people may come in with different needs, and they may be able to be really explicit about that. Again, you want to have career ladders and pipelines. You want to support and mentor people up those ladders so that you're not having a super diverse organization at sort of all the line staff level, and then all the management is just super white facing. I think we can go to the next slide. Inclusion. Yeah, so we talked about some of these: mentors for underrepresented employees, transparency on process requirements for promotion. Again, this is the pipeline issue. You want to make sure that folks come in and they know that there's a path up. They're not going to get stuck where they're sitting. Visible efforts on DEI. Again, a discussion around DEI at all points. Speaking up and responding to microaggressions. Again, this is about creating an environment of inclusion and belonging. So we could do we do whole trainings on responding to microaggressions, but at the end of the day, if someone comes into an organization and they don't feel like they're being respected and they feel like they're being belittled in any number of tiny little ways, it's going to impact their ability to work there and to thrive there. And ultimately, they're going to look for a place where they can work and they can thrive. Conscious attention to building norms with language, not saying guys, flexible work arrangements, helps everybody. I want to talk a little bit about meeting structure, because there's lots of ways that, so one, I love talking about meetings when they're held. There'd be all kinds of bias in about when meetings are held. Are they held during child pickup times? Are they held at a time when some folks just aren't going to be able to make it? who gets invited to the meeting, where are folks sitting, who's talking in the meeting, who's getting talked over in the meeting, who gets listened to in the meeting. We spend a lot of our work life, many of us spend a lot of our time in meetings, and that's where bias and privilege and all of the power dynamics come out in full force. And so the extent that we can be really aware what's happening in meetings and try to mitigate and set some norms and standards around meetings, I think that we can go a long way to mitigating the bias that exists. It's going to exist in our organization. So again, the trick is, how do we mitigate? How do we mitigate? How do we mitigate? And the one other thing I want to mention about building an inclusive, we have a whole training around creating inclusive organizations. But one of the things we talked about in this slide, we talked about transparency and process and requirements for promotion. There's something there also around just transparency in general. So power lurks, information hoarding is a form of power hoarding. So the extent that we can make decision-making transparent so that folks who are the recipients and the of various kinds of decisions that management might be making are part of that decision-making process. They know what that process is like. There's transparency around that process. There's transparency around the implementation. So there's a lot of ways in which transparency in general, we talked about salary transparency, that can all go to creating an environment where folks feel fairly treated and they feel like it's a place where they can belong and it's a place that they're included, and they're not sort of walking around feeling that they're being unfairly treated.
I just want to add one thing to sort of bring it all under a particular umbrella that somebody mentioned in a small group, and I think it was Audrey, but talked about psychological safety, creating psychological safety in the work environment. And so for me, this list of inclusive practices seeks to create just that, right? Seeks to create a situation where people feel like they belong, like they are welcome, like their voices are heard, that they have a right to have an opinion about whatever it might be, and that they are, as Sarah said, invited to provide that feedback, invited to provide ideas, invited to the meetings and the proverbial tables, right? So I think, again, it all sort of sits under this concept of feeling psychologically safety and cared for at work, which I recognize is not always a thing that people discuss at work, but here we are.
I mean, just to build on that for just a bit, that to the extent that you may not have control over the whole organization, and again, we talked about the importance of leadership, but you may work in a small group in which you can set your own, there's cultures within cultures, right? So you can set norms and standards within your own small group that you're working, right? You can work with that group to create norms around bias interruption, to create norms around fair treatment, and create norms of relational norms where folks feel like it's okay to say, hey, that didn't sit right with me, that didn't feel right, and have that be okay. So even though you may not have control over the whole organization, you do have some influence. You do have some ability to change norms with the people that you relate with every day, right? So cultures shift in lots of ways. In fact, most cultures don't shift because somebody on top says, I'm going to create a culture shift, unless you're working a dictatorship, right? Or live in a dictatorship, right? Cultures shift bit by bit because small groups of people, right, create different cultures, and then that seeps out into other small groups because we're all interconnected, right?
That's
so
right.
It's about creating new patterns of behavior within the people that you have the most contact.
Yep, absolutely. I think I'm going to the next slide. Yes. Okay, I'm going to check my time. So we've discussed a lot and we've had great conversation back and forth. So thank you all for that and for your engaging questions, thoughts, comments, ideas. And so what we'd like to do now is give you some time to reflect, right? So we want to integrate your learning as we sort of come to a close in this training session today, and ask for you to sort of take this and think, and you can write this down, you can think about it, you can do however you want. So the question is, given everything that you've discussed and learned about today or talked about today, what are some things that you might want to do next, right? So I want to talk to my HR director tomorrow, just to give you an example, right? I want to blah, blah, blah. I will take action by doing what? I need to talk to or engage with whom? So I'm going to give you, I guess, the 3 minutes that we said on the slide and have you all really think about this. And if you want, you could share in the chat, or you can write it down for yourselves, or you can just think about it, but we'll let you have that time to integrate this. And I think I'm going to stop sharing and put it in the chat. Mhm. You have 2 more minutes. All right, so if we might be interrupting, and if we are, sorry. But if there is anything that you all would like to share out, again, takeaways, plans of action. I saw Teddy wrote in the chat, take action by sharing with our local funding and evaluation committee over some pending NOFA language. Casey wrote, I want to use my voice more to explain how bias and lack of diverse thought affects job performance. Casey, I want to offer you voice now if you'd like to share more about what you wrote before I read the whole thing.
No, thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure. And then you said, I will take action by discussing what I've learned and heard today with my Department of Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Awesome. I need to talk with my supervisor to explain how I experience bias in my own department and at meetings I attend. Very powerful. Anyone else want to type it in the chat or share or questions? We have a little bit of time, so.
I just had one more thought because I'm thinking of things now as this goes along, but you know, even suggesting like Kristen, you know, I know you're working with the state, you know, really directly with Chris, and maybe suggesting that in their NOFA language for, you know, the upcoming, you know, anything that's upcoming, because I know they've rolled a lot out already and there's been, you know, kind of allocations made, but I think the wording on NOFA applications about, you know, how do you, just exactly what you've covered here today, how do you measure diversity, equity, and inclusion in who you fund? I think that would really cause people to think through things. What's your measurement, you know, and it doesn't need to be hard metrics, but, you know, how do you, you know, like I'm even thinking for a local NOFA to say something like, you know, as a question, how do you measure internally, you know, something like that? How do you set up a structure so that your staff is constantly learning? And how do you measure, you know, what's your baseline of your, you know, race equity breakdown? What's your baseline for focus groups, that kind of thing? And have the providers really have to respond to that in the application, because for one thing, they learn from each other, you know, when all the applications go public. And I don't know, I'm just thinking about how could we get that in front of people a little bit better so that they would take action on it, and just being asked very directly, even if it's simple.
And I really appreciate that. Thank you, Teddy. I've written that down. I know that HCD is taking some steps right now to move in that direction. It hasn't quite reached the NOFA level yet, but I definitely can make sure that those in charge of, say, the ESG NOFAs can start to really look at that. And I think it's also a reason why we've had such a focus, even though they don't seem always like they go together, but we've had so much of a focus on HMIS training because we want everyone to really be looking at their data and really understanding. And again, I really appreciate it because the NOFAs will generally say, do you agree to have, DEI procedures in place? And of course, everyone's going to say yes, but it's not the same as showing it. So I really appreciate that perspective, and I will pass that along.
Thank you. I mean, even thinking to something in the NOFA questions about, and I mean, this is really stretching. I'm doing the stretch idea here, but what would your clients say about your inclusive practices?
That is such a good question.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, my ideal would be, if you want to be really inclusionary, is access the local LEAP boards or the local committees of lived experience folks to say, overall in this continuum, how inclusive, or what would you change, given the knowledge, given that they need the knowledge about this kind of formality. I mean, if you want to really get to the bottom of things, I think that, putting it out there to the folks directly.
Totally. I think in the way that you're describing the sort of seek the client's input. So if you're providing a service, you want to seek the client's input to see whether or not the service is landing in the way that you think it's landing. I think the same thing could be said about if you're looking at your organizational structure, again, around recruiting, hiring, and retaining staff, what it would look like if you're asking your staff about whether or not they feel like their environment is inclusionary and whether or not they feel like their voices are being heard and sort of sought out, right? So I think it goes in those directions as well.
Yeah, I think it could apply across the board. It really, you're still seeking input,
right,
in some way. So anyway, just a thought.
Thank you so much, Teddy. So I just noticed the time. It's well, for me, it's 1:30. I forget where everybody is. For you all, it's earlier, but we wanted to show you these. We have some resources and you all are going to get the slides. And so that's just listed there. We are Racial Equity Partners. If you'd like to know more about us, you can visit our website. And Kristen, I'll give it back to you. Oh, unmute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah and Maite. I know that I personally found this session to be really interesting and is leaving me with some great ideas for how I want to move forward and help build the culture at my organization. So I really appreciate that. And I hope that's the same for all the rest of you. So thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session that's been offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next session. And keep in mind that a survey is going to pop up at the end of this session. Please provide your feedback. We really use the surveys to shape our future training and to understand what the needs are of those that are in service to our homeless populations here in California. So please, we take those very seriously. And to everyone, I just wish you a happy Friday and a nice weekend. And thank you for participating.
Thank you so much. You guys have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.